A long time ago, in a quiet village named Sleepy Hollow, strange things were often whispered about. The people in the town said their village was haunted by a terrifying ghost called the Headless Horseman. He rode through the night on a powerful black horse, his body dressed in dark armor, but his head was missing. Instead, he carried a glowing pumpkin that seemed to take the place of his head. No one really knew why the Headless Horseman haunted Sleepy Hollow, but some said he was a soldier who had lost his head during a great war many years ago. His ghost, angry and restless, returned every night to search for his lost head. In the town lived a tall, schoolteacher named Ichabod Crane. Ichabod loved teaching, eating pies, and singing in the church choir, but what he loved most were scary stories. He would sit by the fire at night, listening to old tales about ghosts and monsters, shivering with both fear and excitement. Ichabod also loved Katrina Van Tassel, a kind and pretty girl who lived on a big farm with her wealthy father. Many young men in the village wanted to marry Katrina, but the two who fought hardest for her attention were Ichabod Crane and Brom Van Brunt, who everyone called Brom Bones. Brom was strong, bold, and confident, while Ichabod was clever and charming. One chilly autumn evening, Katrina's family held a big party at their farmhouse. The people of Sleepy Hollow dressed in their best clothes, danced to lively music, and ate delicious food like apple pies and roasted corn. As the night went on, the guests began sharing spooky stories around the fire. Brom Bones, with his deep, booming voice, told a frightening tale about the Headless Horseman. He said that once, while riding home late at night, he had seen the ghost himself. But, Brom boasted, I was too quick for him. My horse galloped faster than the wind, and I escaped. Ichabod listened to Brom's story, his eyes wide with both fear and excitement. He wondered if he, too, might someday see the Headless Horseman. As the party ended, Ichabod prepared to ride home. The moonlight lit the path, but the shadows of the trees looked like long fingers reaching out to grab him. The wind whistled through the leaves, and the sound of crickets seemed louder in the silence of the night. Ichabod's heart pounded as he rode deeper into the forest. Suddenly, he heard the sound of hooves behind him. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder and louder. Ichabod turned his head, and there, in the distance, was a dark figure on a black horse. The rider wore a cape that flapped in the wind, but something was strange. The rider had no head. Ichabod froze in terror. The Headless Horseman was real. The ghost held a glowing pumpkin high in one hand and galloped straight toward him. Go, go, go! Ichabod shouted to his horse, kicking its sides. The horse sprang into action, running as fast as it could. The Headless Horseman chased him, the sound of hooves thundering through the night. Ichabod remembered the old legend. If he could cross the bridge near the church, he would be safe. The ghost could not follow him past the bridge. But the bridge was still far away, and the Headless Horseman was getting closer. The ghost raised the glowing pumpkin, aiming it at Ichabod. Would he make it to the bridge in time? Ichabod clung tightly to his horse's reins, his heart racing faster than the pounding hooves beneath him. The dark figure of the Headless Horseman loomed closer and closer, the eerie glow of the pumpkin lighting up the shadows around him. Ichabod's mind swirled with panic and fear, but he forced himself to focus on one thing, the bridge. Faster, boy, faster. He urged his horse, leaning forward to help it run faster. The forest seemed alive, with branches creaking and leaves rustling as though whispering warnings. Every shadow appeared to move, every sound felt like a threat. The Headless Horseman's ghostly steed galloped with incredible speed, and Ichabod could feel the chill of the ghost's presence right behind him. Just as he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, he saw the outline of the bridge up ahead, shining in the moonlight. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by terror when the ghost raised the glowing pumpkin high above its shoulders. The pumpkin flew through the air, spinning like a fiery comet. Ichabod ducked, clutching the horse's neck as the pumpkin smashed into the ground beside him. The light burst and went out, leaving the path in total darkness. Almost there, Ichabod gasped, urging the horse onward. The bridge was now just a few steps away. He could feel the horse's muscles strain as it leapt onto the wooden planks. The sound of hooves on the bridge echoed loudly, and Ichabod dared to glance back. The Headless Horseman had stopped at the edge of the bridge, his figure shrouded in mist. The ghost let out an unearthly wail, raising his arm in frustration before turning his horse around and disappearing into the woods. Ichabod didn't stop until he was far from the bridge, finally slowing down as he approached the safety of the churchyard. His heart still pounded, and his clothes were soaked with sweat. He looked back one last time, half expecting to see the ghost again, but the night was silent. When he reached the village the next morning, the townspeople gathered around him, eager to hear his story. "The Headless Horseman chased me," Ichabod exclaimed, his voice trembling. "I barely made it to the bridge in time." Some villagers believed him, shivering at the thought of the ghostly rider. Others, including Brom Bones, laughed and teased him. "Are you sure it wasn't just a dream, Ichabod?" Brom asked with a sly grin. But Ichabod was convinced of what he had seen. He stayed in the village for a few more days, always looking over his shoulder, before deciding to leave Sleepy Hollow altogether. Some said he moved to another town to teach, while others believed the Headless Horseman had finally caught him. As days turned to weeks, the story of Ichabod Crane's encounter with the Headless Horseman spread throughout Sleepy Hollow. While some believed Ichabod's tale, others were skeptical. Brom Bones, in particular, seemed to find the whole thing amusing. Whenever Ichabod's name came up, Brom would chuckle and say, "Ah, the poor fellow was probably just scared of his own shadow." But there was something strange about Brom's laughter. It wasn't the hearty laugh of a man who found the story silly, it was the knowing laugh of someone hiding a secret. Katrina noticed this too, though she kept her thoughts to herself. One evening, as the autumn leaves fell and the air grew crisp, Katrina decided to confront Brom. The two were walking near the Van Tassel farm, and the topic of Ichabod's disappearance came up. "Brom," Katrina said, her voice firm but curious, "why do you always laugh about Ichabod and the Headless Horseman? Do you know something you're not telling us?" Brom hesitated, his usually confident expression faltering for a moment. But then he grinned and said, "Katrina, you're too clever for your own good." He leaned in closer and whispered, "I might have had a little fun with Ichabod that night." Katrina's eyes widened. "Brom, what did you do?" Brom shrugged, trying to play it off. "I may have dressed up as the Headless Horseman. It was just a prank. I thought it would scare him, but I didn't expect him to run off and never come back." Katrina frowned. "Brom, that wasn't just a prank. Ichabod truly believed he was being chased by the ghost. You frightened him out of town." Brom looked uncomfortable for the first time. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said quietly. "I thought he'd come back after a day or two. I was just trying to make sure he didn't get too close to you." Katrina crossed her arms, her expression stern. "Brom, you may have won me over, but what you did was wrong. You need to make things right." Brom nodded, guilt creeping into his usually carefree demeanor. "I'll think of something," he promised. Katrina showed the letter to Brom, who turned pale as he read it. "He knows," Brom muttered. "He knows it was me." Katrina looked at Brom with a mix of frustration and pity. "Then you'd better be ready to tell him the truth when he comes back." But just as Brom began planning how he might apologize to Ichabod, a new rumor spread through the town. A farmer claimed to have seen the real Headless Horseman galloping through the woods near the bridge. "It wasn't Brom," the farmer insisted. "I know Brom Bones, and this was no prank." The rider's pumpkin glowed like fire, and his horse moved like a shadow in the wind. The villagers were terrified. Could the Headless Horseman truly exist? Or was it another trick? Katrina, now unsure of what to believe, decided to investigate. She convinced Brom to accompany her one night to the bridge, where they would wait and see if the ghost appeared. As the clock struck midnight, a chilling wind swept through the trees. The sound of galloping hooves echoed in the distance, growing louder and louder. Katrina and Brom froze as a dark figure emerged from the shadows, riding a massive black horse. The rider's headless body glowed faintly in the moonlight, and a fiery pumpkin sat in his hand. Brom's confidence crumbled. "That's not me," he stammered, his voice trembling. The Headless Horseman stopped at the edge of the bridge and pointed at Brom with the pumpkin, as though accusing him of his trickery. The ghost let out a bone-chilling laugh before vanishing into the night. Katrina and Brom stood frozen at the edge of the bridge, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The eerie laughter of the Headless Horseman echoed in their ears long after the ghostly figure disappeared into the woods. Katrina finally broke the silence. "Did you see that, Brom? That wasn't a prank. That was real." Brom, usually brave and confident, looked shaken. "I don't know what that was," he admitted. "But it wasn't me, and it wasn't a trick." Katrina's mind raced. If the real Headless Horseman was haunting Sleepy Hollow, then Ichabod's story wasn't just a tale of fear. It was the truth. The next morning, Katrina called a meeting at her family's farm. She invited the village elders, Brom, and anyone else who had ever encountered strange happenings near the woods. The townsfolk gathered around, whispering nervously about the sighting. Katrina stood up, her voice steady despite the fear that still lingered. "We've all heard the stories about the Headless Horseman," she began. "But last night, Brom and I saw him with our own eyes. He's real, and he's haunting Sleepy Hollow. We need to find out why." One of the elders, an old man named Elias, spoke up. "The legend says the Headless Horseman is searching for his head," he said. "But it's also said that he seeks revenge on the living. Perhaps someone disturbed his grave, or there's something he's protecting." Brom frowned. "I've ridden through those woods 100 times. I've never seen a grave." Elias shook his head. "You wouldn't. His grave is said to be hidden deep in the woods, marked only by a withered tree shaped like a hand reaching out of the ground." Katrina's eyes lit up with determination. "Then we'll find the tree," she said. "If we can learn more about his grave, maybe we can stop him." The next evening, Katrina, Brom, and a small group of villagers ventured into the woods. They carried lanterns and tools, their footsteps crunching on the frosty leaves. The forest felt alive with strange sounds, a hoot from an owl, the rustling of unseen animals, and, occasionally, the distant echo of hooves. "Stay close," Katrina whispered as the group moved deeper into the woods. After hours of searching, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood a twisted, withered tree that looked exactly as Elias had described. Its gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, and the ground around it was bare and cracked. Brom approached the tree cautiously. "If this is his grave, why does it look so empty?" As he spoke, the ground trembled slightly, and a cold wind swept through the clearing. Suddenly, the sound of galloping hooves filled the air, growing louder and louder. The villagers panicked, some dropping their lanterns and running back toward the village. Katrina and Brom stood their ground, fear etched on their faces. From the shadows emerged the Headless Horseman, his black horse rearing up as he pointed his fiery pumpkin at the withered tree. The ghost's presence was overpowering, and Katrina could feel the air grow colder with every second. "I think he's trying to tell us something," Katrina whispered. Katrina stepped closer to the tree, ignoring Brom's protests. She noticed strange carvings on the bark, symbols she didn't recognize but felt were important. As she examined them, she spotted something half buried in the roots of the tree. "Help me dig," she called to Brom. Reluctantly, Brom joined her, using his hands to scrape away the dirt. They uncovered a small, rusted box. The moment they pulled it free, the Headless Horseman let out a piercing cry, his horse stamping the ground in fury. Katrina opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a cracked, weathered skull. "It's his head," Brom said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Headless Horseman dismounted and stepped closer. Though he had no eyes, it felt as though he were staring directly at them. Katrina held up the skull. "Is this what you've been looking for?" she asked. The ghost reached out with a skeletal hand, and as he took the skull, a strange calm settled over the clearing. The fiery pumpkin in his other hand dimmed, and his body began to fade into the night. Before disappearing completely, the Headless Horseman gave a slow, deliberate nod of gratitude. Then, he was gone. When the Headless Horseman vanished, the forest seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The cold air softened, and the eerie tension lifted, leaving Katrina and Brom standing in silence near the withered tree. The skull and the rusted box were now gone, as if they had never existed. Katrina turned to Brom, her expression both relieved and thoughtful. "It's over," she said quietly. "He just wanted what was his." Brom nodded, his usual confidence replaced with humility. "We didn't understand his story," he admitted. "And I made things worse with my tricks." When the group returned to Sleepy Hollow, they told the villagers everything. Some were amazed, others skeptical, but most were relieved to hear that the Headless Horseman's haunting was likely over. The tale of the Headless Horseman left Sleepy Hollow with valuable lessons that the villagers would pass down for generations. 1. Respect history and the dead. The Headless Horseman's restless spirit was tied to a forgotten past. The villagers learned to honor those who came before them and not to disturb sacred places or memories. 2. The consequences of trickery. Brom's prank on Ichabod seemed harmless at first but had far-reaching consequences. His actions frightened Ichabod out of town and nearly backfired when the real ghost appeared. The villagers learned that dishonesty and pranks can hurt others more than we realize. 3. Courage in the face of fear. Katrina's bravery in confronting the horsemen and seeking the truth inspired everyone. It showed that fear can be overcome with determination and a willingness to understand. 4. Helping others find peace. Sometimes, even the scariest things are just misunderstood. The horseman wasn't evil, he was lost, searching for something taken from him. By returning his skull, Katrina and Brom gave his spirit the peace it needed to move on. A new beginning for Sleepy Hollow. With the Headless Horseman gone, Sleepy Hollow became a quieter, happier place. Brom became a more thoughtful man, realizing that his actions carried weight. He and Katrina eventually married and shared the story of the horsemen with their children, always reminding them of the lessons they had learned. As for Ichabod Crane, he never returned to Sleepy Hollow. Some said he became a successful teacher in another town, while others whispered that he might still be running from shadows in the night. But one thing was certain: the legend of the Headless Horseman lived on, not as a story of terror, but as a reminder of the importance of truth, courage, and compassion. For more future tales, don't forget to show some love by hitting the like and subscribe button.